October 2, 1942, Muroc Dry Lake, California. The Mojave sun bakes a cracked sheet of dry lake bed chosen for one quality above all others. It is empty, no one is watching. Robert Stanley climbs into a cockpit unlike any other in the country. In front of him there is no propeller. The day before, this machine had been towed to the flight line wearing a fake wooden propeller bolted to its nose and a heavy tarpaulin thrown over its back, disguised as an ordinary piston fighter so that even the airfield's own ground crews would not guess what it was. A mechanic walks forward and removes the wooden blade before the run. Stanley eases the throttles open. There is no cough and thunder of pistons. There is only a thin, rising whine that no American had ever heard from one of their own aircraft. The machine is the Bell XP-59A Airacomet. Within seconds, it lifts from the lakebed, and the United States enters the jet age. This should be the opening of a triumph. It is the opening of something far stranger, because this aircraft, the first jet America ever flew, would never fire its guns at an enemy. It would be tested, doubted, and quietly set aside. Its own pilots would call it a disappointment. The Army would rule it unfit for battle. For the rest of its short life, it would be the jet that got sidelined. And yet every American jet that came after owes its existence to this single machine on this empty lakebed. The shooting star that fought over Korea, the saber that swept the skies, none of them take to the air without the Airacomet going first. This is the story of how a fighter that never saw combat, a fighter written off as a failure, became the aircraft that carried the United States into the jet age. To understand why the Airacomet mattered, you have to go back to a spring in England, 1941. The most powerful air force in the world was not American. The United States had thousands of fine piston fighters and not a single jet. It had no jet engine, no jet aircraft, and almost no one who understood the technology. Britain and Germany were already years ahead, working with a kind of propulsion most American engineers had never even seen. In April 1941, Major General Henry Arnold, the head of the United States Army Air Forces, crossed the Atlantic to find out how far behind his country had fallen. The British showed him a small, propellerless aircraft climbing into the sky on the thrust of a turbine designed by an engineer named Frank Whittle. Arnold later said it was a plane such as he had never seen before. He understood at once what it meant. The piston fighter, the weapon that was deciding the air war, was about to become obsolete. The implications were stark. Across the Channel, Germany was already developing a jet of its own, a fighter that would one day be known as the Messerschmitt 262. If the Germans put a 400-mile-per-hour jet into the sky against piston fighters, straining to reach that figure, the whole air war could turn. America was not behind by months. It was behind by years. Every week spent catching up was a week the enemy might use to build an advantage that could not be answered. For a nation that prided itself on outproducing the world, falling behind in the most important new weapon of the age was not a risk anyone in Washington was willing to accept. Arnold moved with unusual speed. He secured the plans for Whittle's engine and arranged to have a complete example flown across the ocean in the belly of a B-24 Liberator in October 1941, along with a handful of British engineers. The engine first ran at a General Electric plant in Lynn, Massachusetts that same autumn. Whittle himself crossed the Atlantic the following summer to help solve the problems that came with it. The choice of builders was deliberate. Arnold handed the engine to General Electric, a company that built turbo superchargers and understood spinning turbines better than anyone in the country. The engine that grew out of that work, later known as the J-31, would become the first turbojet built in quantity in the United States. More than 240 of them would be produced before the war ended. But in the autumn of 1941, not one had yet powered an aircraft into the sky. The airframe Arnold gave to a man in Buffalo, New York. Lawrence Bell, the founder of Bell Aircraft, agreed to build 3 prototypes around an engine that did not yet exist, for a kind of flight no American had ever attempted. He was asked to do it in months, in total secrecy, with no margin for failure. Everything about the program was buried in secrecy. To hide it, the Army gave the project a deliberately misleading name, attaching it to a canceled piston design so that anyone who read the paperwork would assume it was old and uninteresting. The engine itself was labeled as if it were just another turbo supercharger. The aircraft that would change American aviation forever was concealed inside a lie, and the lie held. The work was done behind painted and welded windows in a former automobile factory in downtown Buffalo, a building that had once turned out luxury cars. Bell engineers, among them Harlan Poyer and Robert Wolfe, designed an aircraft around two of the new engines, buried inside the fuselage on either side of the pilot. There was no precedent to follow. Every choice was a guess. To protect the secret, General Arnold even forbade high-speed wind tunnel testing, which meant the designers were working half-blind, unable to check their work against the data that would normally guide them. The first prototype was shipped by rail across the country to Muroc in September 1942, still wearing its dummy propeller. The disguise held all the way to the desert, where mechanics would mount and remove the wooden blade for each run, so that anyone glancing across the lakebed would see only a conventional fighter. On October 1, during what was meant to be a high-speed taxi run, Robert Stanley let the aircraft lift a few feet from the lakebed, the first time an American jet had ever left the ground. The next day, he flew it in earnest, climbing first to 6,000 feet, then to 10,000. The men who watched it pass overhead, silent of propeller, described a sound and a shape that did not seem to belong to their own time. Later that same day, an Army officer named Colonel Lawrence Craigie took the controls and became the first American military pilot ever to fly a jet. For all that history, the numbers were a disappointment. The early engines produced only about 1,650 pounds of thrust each, far less than the designers had been promised. The Airacomet's top speed settled around 413 miles per hour. That was respectable for 1942, but it was not the leap everyone had imagined. A piston-engined P-51 Mustang already in squadron service was nearly as fast and far more agile in a fight. Worse, the aircraft would not hold still. Above 290 miles per hour, it began to snake through the air, weaving left and right, which made it a poor platform for aiming guns. The engines were temperamental and short-lived, as all early jets were. During dive testing, one P-59A lost its entire tail section in the air. The test pilot, Jack Willems, bailed out and survived. Another Airacomet came down hard in a belly landing. The armament was conventional. A single 37mm cannon and 350 caliber machine guns, all packed into the nose. On paper it could fight. In practice it could barely hold its sights steady at speed. The Army was already losing faith. An early plan to build 100 Airacomets, with hundreds more proposed, was cut back. In October 1943, the order was trimmed to 50 aircraft. In the end, counting prototypes and service test machines, just 66 would ever be built. A program begun in desperation was being quietly shrunk before the first squadron had even formed. And looming on the horizon was another American jet, still on the drawing board, that would make every one of these shortcomings impossible to forgive. Its name was the Shooting Star, and it would do almost everything the Airacomet could not. But that reckoning was still a year away. For now, the Airacomet was the only jet America had, and it carried a gift that the speed charts could not measure. The gift was not speed, it was forgiveness. The Airacomet's two engines were weak, but two of them gave a pilot a margin no single engine jet of the era could match. If one quit, and early jets quit often, the other could carry him home. In the air, the aircraft handled much like the piston fighters these men already knew. It took off, climbed, and landed without surprising them. For a generation of airmen who had never imagined flight without the steady pull of a propeller, that ordinariness was the most valuable quality the aircraft could possess. Robert Stanley, who flew it first, later said he had less trouble and fewer mechanical interruptions with the Airacomet than with any other prototype he had ever flown. That was not the verdict of a man describing a death trap. It was the verdict of a man describing a teacher, because that is what the Airacomet became. Not a weapon, but a classroom. Every American who needed to learn the strange new physics of jet flight learned it here. The slow, lazy response of the throttle, the long takeoff roll, the way speed built and bled away differently without a propeller biting the air, the first jet pilots, the first jet mechanics, the first men who understood how to keep a turbine alive on the ground, all of them came up through the Airacomet. When the next jet arrived, faster and far more demanding, the men who climbed into it were not strangers to the technology. They had already learned its language on this aircraft. Some of these aircraft even carried a second open cockpit grafted into the nose, so an observer could ride along and watch, exposed to the wind, in what may be the only open cockpit jet ever flown. Lawrence Bell himself rode up there. The image captures the whole strange moment, the future of flight, with a man sitting out in the open air, learning as he went. This was the aircraft's real innovation, not a feature of metal and wire, but a decision. Build something safe enough to learn on, and you build the foundation for everything that follows. If you're finding this interesting, subscribing takes a second and helps the channel. By early 1944, War, the Army wanted an answer to one hard question. Could the Airacomet actually fight? In February, they put it to the test. At Muroc, the jet was flown in mock combat against the very aircraft it had been built to replace, a P-38 Lightning, a P-47 Thunderbolt, and in some trials, a captured Japanese Zero. The result was not close. The piston fighters, designs already years old, outturned and outfought the jet in nearly every pass. The Airacomet was faster in a straight line, but it could not turn that speed into a victory in a dogfight, and its snaking gun platform meant it struggled to hold an enemy in its sights long enough to shoot. The aircraft that was supposed to vault past the piston age could not beat the piston age in a mock fight over the California desert. The pilots who flew those trials came away with the same impression. The jet was a glimpse of the future, but the future was not ready, and neither was this aircraft. Captain Frederick Trapnell, the first United States Navy pilot ever to fly a jet, put it plainly. Its performance, he said, was at first distinctly unimpressive. A long takeoff, a slow climb. This was the honest assessment of a man who wanted the technology to succeed. In the middle of 1944, an Army Evaluation Board delivered the verdict that sealed the aircraft's fate. According to the board's own report, it did not believe the P-59 was suited for combat, and it did not believe that any change short of a completely new design could make it so. That was the end of the Airacomet as a fighter. There would be no squadrons sent overseas, no combat missions, no kills. Here's the number that explains the decision. The Airacomet's top speed in service was around 410 miles per hour. The P-51 Mustang, a piston fighter already flying combat missions over Europe, was nearly its equal in speed and far better in a fight. America had spent 2 years and a fortune in secrecy to build a jet that could not reliably outrun its own propeller-driven aircraft. And yet, even as it was being pushed aside, the Airacomet kept making history. It equipped the 412th Fighter Group, activated at Muroc in November 1943, the first jet fighter unit in American history, later commanded by the Flying Tigers' ace Colonel David Hill. From scattered fields across California, at Palmdale, at Bakersfield, at Santa Maria, the group put pilot after pilot through the unfamiliar discipline of jet flight. These were the men who would carry that knowledge into the cockpits of every jet that came next. In December 1943, the test pilot Jack Willems climbed an Airacomet to 47,600 feet, higher than any American had ever taken a jet. In April 1943, Captain Trapnell became the Navy's first jet aviator, and on October 14, 1944, at Wright Field, Ann Baumgartner, a pilot in the women's flying program, lifted a YP-59A off the runway and became the first American woman ever to fly a jet aircraft. The Airacomet would never fight, but every month it stayed in the air, it was teaching an entire nation how. The aircraft that ended the Airacomet's career was already flying. In the summer of 1943, the Army had handed a second jet project to Lockheed and to a young engineer named Clarence Johnson, known to everyone as Kelly. Working with a small, hand-picked team in a rented building, the group that would become famous as the Skunk Works built a complete jet fighter from a blank sheet of paper in 143 days. It first flew in January 1944, with test pilot Milo Burcham at the controls. It was called the P-80 Shooting Star, and it was everything the Airacomet was not: a single, powerful engine, a clean, fast, purposeful airframe. On test, it reached 502 miles per hour, the first American aircraft to pass 500 miles per hour in level flight. After watching his jet fly, Kelly Johnson said the demonstration was such a complete success that it overcame the temporary advantage the Germans had gained from years of work. Be honest about what that meant. The Shooting Star was faster, deadlier, and ready for a war the Airacomet could only watch. 4 of them were rushed to Europe in the final weeks before victory, though the fighting ended before they could be thrown into combat. It went on to become America's first operational jet fighter and the first American jet to fight in combat years later in the skies over Korea. On November 8, 1950, a Shooting Star flown by First Lieutenant Russell Brown was credited with downing a MiG-15 in what is often called the first jet against jet battle in history. Every laurel the Airacomet was denied denied the shooting star collected. Its two-seat trainer version would go on to teach jet flight to airmen around the world for decades. There is even a verdict from the man best placed to judge. The British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew more types of aircraft than anyone in history, more than 487 of them, ranked the Airacomet among his 10 least favorite machines he ever flew. On its own terms as a fighter, the case against it is closed. But here's the question the speed charts cannot answer. Who taught the men who flew the shooting star? Who proved that an American jet could be built, flown, and trusted at all? The answer lies on a dry lakebed in 1942, 2 full years before the shooting star ever left the ground. The Airacomet flew first, and because it flew first, it was the aircraft that absorbed the risk, found the failures, and trained the cadre of pilots and mechanics who would make the next jet a success. For the work of pioneering, none of the shooting star's advantages mattered at all. You cannot teach a nation to fly jets with an aircraft that does not yet exist. The Airacomet existed first. In the end, that was the only thing that counted. So let us settle the legend. You will hear it said that the Airacomet flew the first jet combat mission. It did not. The aircraft never saw combat at all. The first jets to fight were not American. They were the German Messerschmitt 262 and the British Gloucester Meteor, both in 1944. The first American jet to go to war was the Shooting Star in Korea, long after the Airacomet had been retired to the training fields. You will also hear that it once flew from the deck of the carrier USS Shangri-La. There's no record that it ever did. The Navy judged its jets unfit for the deck without ever sending one to sea. What remains when the myths are cleared away is the truth, and the truth is enough. Bell built just 66 Airacomet. Not one of them fired a shot in anger. Almost all were used to train the first generation of American jet airmen and then scrapped or quietly stored. The very first one, the machine Robert Stanley lifted off that lakebed, survives today in the Smithsonian, hanging among the milestones of flight with fewer than 60 hours in its entire logbook. Others rest at the Air Force Museum in Ohio, at March Field in California, and in a small village in Nebraska, where a pioneer of the jet age sits far from any runway. At Plains of Fame in California, one is being coaxed slowly back toward flight so that the sound Stanley first heard over the desert might one day be heard again. The Airacomet failed every test by which history remembers a fighter. It never won a dogfight. It never sank a ship. It never claimed a kill. By those measures, it was a disappointment, exactly as its critics said. But fighters are not the only thing that wins the future. Someone has to go first. Someone has to fly the unproven machine off the empty lakebed, find every flaw the hard way, and hand the lessons to the aircraft that comes next. Not the fastest, not the most famous, not even, in the end, a combatant, but the first. The Airacomet was the aircraft that taught America how to fly into the jet age. Everything that followed took off from the runway it built.